Hey. Welcome to Net Choice's panel today. I am Barbara Comstock, a former adopting European antitrust spelled disaster for introduce. First, I would like to mention that Tad Lipsky, unfortunately, was not able to join us. He's an adjunct professor and director of the Competition Advocacy Program at the Global Antitrust Institute, and he's not able to attend due to some unforeseen personal circumstances, but we appreciate his great work and strong work at antitrust analysis and his extensive experience in competition policy. Chris Marchese of NetChoice will replace him today for the purposes of our discussion. Chris received his JD from George Mason University here in Virginia, a great institution, which I will be happy to promote with everybody. And he is also a member of the DC Bar. Next, we have Aurelien Porteus, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he is the Director of Antitrust and Innovation Policy at ITIF. He leads the Schumpeter Project on Competition Policy for the Innovation Economy, advancing a dynamic framework for competition policy in which innovation is a central concern for antitrust enforcement, not a secondary consideration. He is also an adjunct professor of law at the Global Antitrust Institute of George Mason University, again, thank you, and at the Catholic University of Paris. As an expert in US antitrust and EU competition law and economics, he has published extensively on these issues and has presented his research at international conferences. With 10 years of university experience in the UK, France, Belgium, and the US, his research encompasses US and European perspectives on the regulation of competition. His book, Antitrust Populism, Competition Policy in the Digital Era, will be published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. And what a timely book. Look forward to reading that. And then Kathy Gellis is also joining us, who is a lawyer specializing in the convergence of technology and civil liberties. Her practice includes advocacy and counsel related to copyright, intellectual property, free speech, privacy, and other innovation policy matters affecting technology use and development, with a particular focus on how these issues interact with internet platforms and how the law affecting platforms also affects the public. Prior to becoming a lawyer, Kathy worked as a webmaster in Silicon Valley and France. So we got some good French connections here today. In most of her positions, she sat at the intersection between those developing technology and those developing the businesses around the technology, translating the needs of both constituencies into this new web-based communications medium. She has a BA from the University of California at Berkeley in mass communications and sociology, where she studied information technology and user adoption trends. And she also has a JD from Boston University. Whoops.
Seems we're having some technical difficulties.
Okay. My apologies. I'm back. I'm not sure what happened here. I'm not sure where I left you. Had I finished introducing Kathy, or did I shortchange you? My apologies. Okay, now hopefully we will be able to be here. So why don't we start out with, at a high level, what are the main similarities and differences between the American and European approaches to antitrust? Such as, what are the main purposes of each? Who do they protect? And how are they analyzed and reviewed? I'll kick it over to you, whoever would like to start.
Well, I'll jump in here just because I find this really interesting. I think when you're talking about antitrust, whether it's in the United States or in the European Union, you always have to ask, exactly what you just said, Barbara, which is, what is the goal of antitrust? What are you trying to do with this enforcement regime? In the United States, we have long thought of antitrust as a way to protect consumers from anti-competitive business practices that end up raising prices, stifling innovation, or reducing quality. That's kind of been the standard now for about 50 years, and it's worked very well. In the EU, and I'll let the other panelists speak to this with their own personal experience, but in the EU, I think it's a different approach in that they don't necessarily want to protect just consumers. They have a broader view of antitrust where they think that it can be a tool to protect different groups of society. So you have, labor organizations and workers, but also consumers and also small rivals. And I think that is a huge difference between the United States and Europe, because here we have long said that our antitrust laws protect consumers, not competitors, meaning, the government will intervene only when there is harm to consumers, not harm to other businesses. In Europe, the antitrust enforcers will intervene in the marketplace when they think that, large popular businesses are competing too fiercely, too aggressively, that they would like them to play a little bit nicer with their rivals and so forth. And I think that is probably the core difference, that in the US, we focus just on consumers and we don't necessarily care if a business is big or small. We just care about what are they actually doing to benefit consumers. Where Europe, big in a sense is bad. The EU, I think, has a very skeptical view of large corporations. So.
I just want to toss in a thought here about sort of the tradition and where we are now. I think one of the things traditionally is that America has a pretty great tolerance for laissez-faire in the market. Let the companies do what they're going to do, freedom to contract. We occasionally constrain that periodically, but I think there's been an appetite historically to start from that place, that a company exists, a company's good, it should be allowed to do its business. And you have an ethos in Europe where state control of a market is not seen as anathema to its public policy goals, that Germany in particular sort of liked state-run cartels, that there was sort of like, this is going to help make sure that economically we're protected because we have the state playing a role to help protect us. That appetite maybe have ebbed and waned over the years, but that's kind of two competing influences that I think historically, in terms of answering the question, would be the fundamental difference between an EU approach and an American approach, that the appetite for where we think the state should be tends to be very different. Where we are right now is that I'm not sure there's a difference at all, because right now the impetus behind a lot of these proposals have very little to do with antitrust as a core principle and everything to do with everybody hates the big tech companies. So right now there's no space between them, because right now what is getting characterized as antitrust is really, let's go after big tech, and both continents want to do it with equal veracity, or voraciousness and influence and hatred of the companies. The hatred does have some different characteristics on both coasts and some different defenses for technology, but right now they're both trying to do the same thing. So the moves that one continent makes has a lot of appeal over here if you're trying to accomplish the same thing.
Yeah, I can follow up on those very interesting points that have been made, and just perhaps frame my main point around 3 points, like the main dissimilarities, differences between the EU and the US systems are threefold. The system is different, the objectives are different, and the content of the rules are different. So first of all, the system, very broadly defined, antitrust in the US is a law enforcement system. The courts are the primary enforcers of antitrust. In the EU, it's an administrative system. It's a bureaucratic regime whereby very detailed, very narrow administrative rules are enforced by administrative agencies. So the core ideological difference is the fact that antitrust agencies in the US are just pushing for cases to be brought forward to the court so that the court can, at the end of the day, decide. Whereas in the EU, it's the agencies, the administration decides. The objective, just to follow up on what Chris has said, this is totally right in the sense that in the EU competition law was not about the consumer welfare standards, and is only marginally about the consumer welfare standard. The primary objective of EU competition law is simple, is the single market, is the completion of the single market. So mean that EU competition law is an ancillary policy as part of the free movement of goods, free movement of services, as part of the completion of the internal market within the EU. So meaning that when the drafters of the EU treaties thought about EU competition law, it was not in order to protect consumers, it was to prevent cartels at the national level, which would prevent the free flow of goods and free flow of services and free flow of persons throughout the EU. So the EU competition policy as perhaps its own primary and most important objective, the single market. I mean, and that's why, for example, there cannot be some territorial discrimination, right? Price discrimination along state lines, which are completely fine in the US, are per se prohibited in the EU because it goes against the single market objectives. So the consumer welfare standard, or at least the interest for consumers, I mean, emerged in the EU as a follower of the Chicago School very lately, and it's never been, and it is not yet, the primary objective of EU competition rules. So it's very important to have that in mind, in the sense that when we have, for example, the discussion about the Digital Markets Act, the regulation of big tech in the EU, it's all about completing the so-called digital single market. It's all about this idea of completing the internal market somehow. It's not necessarily about consumer welfare or consumer benefits. It's about completing the internal market, which is a complete different objective that I think the US doesn't have, right? I think the internal market in the US has been completed perhaps a century ago. It doesn't have, it's not in the process of being fully completed. And finally, on the content, I think the content of the rules are very, very different, even if you may think that Section 1 of the Sherman Act resembled Article 101 of the treaties, and Section 2 resembled Article 102. At the end of the day, the content of the EU competition rules are very different. When we talk about abuse of dominant position, of course, the threshold is much lower than what we have in the US. When we talk about a number of practices that are prohibited in the EU, whereas they are considered under the rule of reason as legitimate in the US, for example, excessive pricing. In the EU, excessive price, I mean, there's a lot of cases that prohibit excessive pricing, whereas courts in the US have considered that there cannot be excessive pricing because, as Katie has said, there's this idea of self-correcting, and the fact that if there's an excessive pricing, that will be precisely the motive or the entrepreneurial motive for a competitor to step in the market. Also, the refusal to deal. There's a provision in the EU that companies cannot refuse to deal with a competitor, and this there's no such obligation in the US. Also on rebates, on discounts, on predatory pricing, on many conduct, the EU is much more aggressive than the US, and it's of course enforced in an administrative way rather than in a purely judicial manner. And I think this, explain this found its ground in the ideological differences. Just to come back to what Katie and Chris has said, the idea that in the EU, the state has to intervene in order to regulate and structure the market in small and medium-sized companies, which are equally capable of competing. And that comes from the German order liberal ideology, which means that there must be a number of firms which are of equal size, and they must be able to compete. But that is not an objective that is fully in line with the consumer welfare standard that we have in the EU. So overall, there's a complete different view of the role of the state and the desirability of the state to intervene in the market. The EU is more worried about false negative, and the US is more worried about false positive. The EU is more worried about market failure. The US is more worried about regulatory failures. I mean, there's these ideological differences which are so profound that makes us, wonder why some neo-Brandisians and some people in the political spectrum in the US want to just transplant the EU competition regime into the US without having this full understanding that this comes with the whole of the case law, whole of ideological underpinning that they may not be aware of.
Well, and given the title of our program today about whether the European, antitrust standard would spell disaster for us, I can't help but noting that the EU does not have any of the large tech companies. When you look at the top 20, 11 of them, I believe the stats are US companies. The other 9 are China companies. And so while China is growing and competing, the US is still ahead. And so I'd certainly, in terms of world competition, adopting the EU standard that has resulted in no major tech companies would seem to be contrary to what we want to do in terms of being a competitive economy, right? But I will let you comment on that, but also wanted to ask Chris and Kathy that, along those lines of what you've all said, we've recently seen enthusiasm among many on the left, but also, some on the right. So there's sort of populism response to adopt Europe's abuse of dominance standard. So what is that standard, and why has it been raised more and more in the American, sort of new antitrust looks? And then I'd ask Aurelian, I think you may have already answered it, but should the US import it? And maybe why not, or what would be the consequences of importing that? So I guess first to Chris and Kathy.
Sure. So I'll start by talking about monopolies. In the United States, our first antitrust law was enacted in 1890, and it was in response to the trusts of the time, especially the railroad trusts. And so Congress chose to call those trusts monopolies. And, I think as most Americans understand, the United States does not like monopolies. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But basically, under our current law, if you have monopoly power, which is roughly 75% market share, the Supreme Court has never found monopoly power below that, but lower courts have. But regardless, it's a substantial amount of control over the market. And once you hit that level of control, we then say you can't do things that are going to hurt consumers, right? So again, we even make our law about monopolies be about consumers. In the EU, instead of having an anti-monopoly law, they have an abuse of dominance standard. And the EU doesn't really care if you actually control the
And I
marketplace.
don't know if, okay, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, anyway, the EU doesn't really care if you actually control the market. Instead, it finds dominance whenever you have enough market share that you can kind of have an effect on the market. So in the EU, they've found dominance at 40% and 35% market share, which is obviously much different from the United States, where we peg it at about 75. But even beyond that, again, even if you have monopoly power in the United States, it only is unlawful if you abuse that power in a way that hurts consumers. In the EU, they don't really require any proof of harm. They're more willing to just kind of say, well, you have some control over the market, and we don't trust that you're going to use that control in ways that we like. So we're going to impose all of these obligations on you, all these special rules about how you can compete in our marketplace. And I think the reason why the abuse of dominance standard is so popular among the progressive left and a few on the populist right is because it is such a wishy-washy standard that it really does give complete control to the government. And the government can say, like, you know what, we think you're dominant and we think you're abusing that dominance. And of course, neither one of those terms is defined. New York State, for example, is considering a law that would import the abuse of dominance standard. And it is incredibly wishy-washy. It's basically, if the government thinks that, or I should say, or a rival, if the government or a rival thinks that you are too dominant and that you are, competing unfairly, they can bring a lawsuit. And there's really no objective standard, where here, the US has the consumer welfare standard where the government must prove that you are hurting consumers before you're going to be found guilty. That's just not true in Europe.
I was going to jump in at the end of that last question with the observation that the destruction is the point. That I think a lot of the animus driving the current American proposals are not necessarily to save the market, but to get rid of a couple of companies that they don't like. Now, I suppose there's the view that getting rid of the companies they don't like would be beneficial, but what Chris was talking about, the wishy-washy standard, is that shouldn't be good enough, because, I mean, I agree that sometimes the companies do things that are, just what, why, stop it, this is stupid. But, in trying to get rid of those acts, you are wiping away a lot of other acts, and you're also poisoning, salting the earth so that you can't get a better competitor, because now you've created a regulatory terrain that is absolutely toxic for any new competitor to grow up in. Because if you could, congratulations, Google, you started in a garage and now you're dead. That's not a trajectory that a startup is going to want to put themselves on. You're going to want to be, I left from my garage and I can actually stay a going concern indefinitely into the future. And if you have this completely arbitrary, we know it when we see it, and now you're bad and we're going to break you up, that is not particularly great for the rule of law or consistency or any sort of, like, what do you actually want to have be better? If you don't like your Google, you would like a better Google, but now you've made it completely unpalatable for anybody to ever invest in something better than Google. Something else that came up that brought to mind with the wishy-washy thing is the perception of harm, and that Europe is comfortable with indulging we have decided this is bad and we're going to act upon this. And the thought that came to mind was the example of Walmart, because in Europe, at least for many years, I mean, particularly in Germany, you couldn't have extended hours, even though that might be helpful for your customers, because the German regulators thought that extended hours was somehow anti-competitive. So hours were constrained. You can't do sales because that's competing on price, and somehow that is perceived as bad. So something that in America we'd see as actually pro-consumer was thought of by European regulators as bad consumers. So Walmart comes along.
No, I don't think Americans know that. I think that those are very good points that I think most Americans are not aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is still true in France, and Aurelian can correct me, but like, the sales that happen like twice a year, where the companies can put their stuff on sale, whereas in America it's happening every weekend, so or every day even. We would see that as, of course you're competing, of course this is customer friendly because you're going to make my stuff cheaper and I'm going to be more likely to shop because you made my stuff cheaper. But that's not the instinct of a lot of European regulators. They see that as, this must be bad and we must stomp it out. So some company like Walmart comes along and they wanted to do business in a Walmart-y sort of way. And they had a lot of trouble getting into Germany because the Walmart sort of way of doing business that works in the United States, and just for politics, we'll talk the basics of, like, you know, hours and the fact that we've got lots of goods and services and you can return things and you can compete on price. We'll leave it as that, as the Walmart-y way. They had to fight a lot of fights to get into Germany to do that. And they actually won. They got in, they went into Germany, and then they failed because it turns out that German consumers didn't like to shop that way. So Walmart has now left Germany. But it was that sort of, it's wishy-washy, like, are competing on price and having sales a good thing or a bad thing? And you know, the Europeans are going to decide the way that's consistent with them, but we should think long and hard from the American perspective of, is wishy-washy good? And does wishy-washy actually result in us picking things that might not actually be good for us? And it's not nailed down. The third point I want to make, which is also an important one to probably come back to, is this is incoherent. And one of the problems is we are saying things right now that are in conflict with each other. On the one hand, we have this great cry that's rising up to say monopolies are bad. And on the other hand, we're turning around and say, here, company, here's your monopolies. So we give intellectual property sort of protections. We give patents, we give copyrights, trademark rights, trade secrets, all sorts of things that let competitors lock out anybody else from using stuff, even though that means that nobody else can compete with them with the use of that thing. And, like, if we don't like monopolistic behavior, why are we handing out the monopolies that enable it? It sort of seems like if we're objecting to certain monopolistic practices, start there with not actually fortifying them and doubling down and giving the companies the tools to be monopolistic. Let's change the law in a way that actually incentivizes them and makes it possible for companies to actually compete more fluidly. And then we'll see if we still have any problems that we need to fix.
So Aurelian, over to you. I'd say, you know, not only should the US import this European model, but what would be the results if we did? What are some of the examples and some more along that line of what would that mean to American consumers?
Yeah, so I would like to just perhaps start with a more historical perspective, just to take some step back, because for many years, all the discussion was about the European becoming more closer to the American antitrust system. And that's how precisely the consumer welfare standards came into Europe with what we called the more economic approach. It was in 2004. And so all the discussion was how to get the European competition system more Americanized. And that's what precisely we've tried. I mean, in the EU, they've done it around the 2000s and even 2010. If you look at Commissioner Almunia, and I mean, there was a lot of discussions on how to bring the US regime and the European regime more closer together, but more on the American page, if you want. And so it was precisely what I said, that the single market objective was counterbalanced with a more consumer welfare standard, as the US antitrust laws and case law has developed over decades. So how can we now be discussing a complete shift that there is not the EU competition law becoming more and more Americanized, but it's the US antitrust laws becoming more and more Europeanized? How can that happen? Well, I think the only answer, very short, very simple, is the tech clash. We love to hate the big companies that are popular to consumers, and
politicians love to hate them.
Yeah,
the actual consumers. Right?
I mean, it's very. That's why I consider as populist. it's very, yeah, as you just said, politicians, it's very politically perhaps rewarding just to criticize Silicon Valley, and that may give you some extra votes for some elections. So this is how you can see it. And the very start, where you can see that Americans started to really look at Europeans and be very interested in what's going on. And the neo-Brandisians, the progressives, were saying that we should import and transplant American law. It was with the Google fines. Google shopping fines in 2017, Google Android fines in 2018, Google Adblock fines in 2019. All these series of fines suddenly sparked a huge appeal by progressives and say that this is exactly what we should be doing. But even if you look at, I mean, on the right, President Trump said that the Europeans fined American tech companies. They were not wrong in finding them. They were wrong because they cashed in the money, and it should be the Americans that should cash in the fines. So there was this whole appeal, both from the left. In the Democrats, it was the 2016 Better Deal manifesto, where the Democrats really looked at how they could reinvigorate antitrust in a more European way. And there was also this from the right, I mean, from the President Trump presidency, or even on the left, this appeal that we should break up this company or find this company and take this money in the US. And this was exactly the rhetoric, the discourse that took place since 2017 to 2020, and 2017 when was the article from Lina Khan was published, which was very influential in changing the debate in the US. And so the question was, why can't US antitrust agencies fine these tech companies as the European do? And the very premise was that they can do it. European can sue these companies because their laws are different, and this is completely wrong, right? You can sue these companies under U.S. antitrust laws. This is exactly what happened last year with Google lawsuit and Facebook lawsuit. So the idea that we should change U.S. antitrust laws because otherwise we couldn't sue these companies, I think is just first, is misguided in terms of the legal analysis. We can sue these companies if we want to. And second of all, it's misguided, I think I would say, in the content, because that will harm innovation, and we'll come to that discussion if you want to. But I think this is misguided in the sense that lowering the threshold from monopolization or attempt to monopolize the market to an abuse of dominant position will lower the threshold and harm many, and will just sanction many innovative and pro-competitive behaviors just because they harm rivals. But disruptive innovation is about harming rivals. Disruptive innovation is about precisely disrupting the incumbents. So at some point is when competition harm rivals, it might be anti-competitive, but sometimes it is pro-competitive to harm the incumbents in an innovative way. And I think that transplanting the abuse of dominant position standards from Europe to the US will create many false positives, where many conducts that are deemed to be pro-competitive and pro-innovative will end up being considered as anti-competitive because they just harm the traditional incumbents. And that is very much like stifling innovation.
Great. And why don't we pick up on enforcement then? Because critics often claim that U.S. antitrust laws are too lax and that antitrust enforcement agencies are too permissive. Mm-hmm. By contrast, they point, as you pointed out, to the EU's active use of antitrust law to investigate businesses and force, behavioral changes on them. So how does the European approach balance the welfare of consumers with its other antitrust goals, and how does it make that trade-off? And then for Kathy or Aurelian, is the EU's aggressive enforcement superior? I think we've kind of addressed that all, but I'll let you both, let you all address the whole enforcement issue, and what are the costs?
Should I? I think it's to have an open textured competition regime such as the EU has, where you put a lot of objectives into the competition regimes. I mean, inevitably create some arbitrary power, or at least legal uncertainty and a lack of legal predictability. I mean, if you just last couple of months, we saw that the EU competition want to put some green objectives into the EU competition policy. So when you start thinking about putting so many objectives, social goals, environmental goals, political objectives, or income inequalities objectives into the US antitrust, into the EU competition law, then at the end of the day, you increase the discretionary power of the court. And that is exactly what the European Court itself criticized in a case of Intel in 2017, the case of Intel, where the European Court of Justice struck down the case of Intel because of a lack of evidentiary basis by the European Commission. So at some point, when there's so many presumptions, where things are so clear-cut, there's like a quick look, and you don't have to demonstrate the fact, or you don't have to demonstrate the harm. At the end of the day, you lower the evidentiary standard so low that you're presumed guilty, and there are many behaviors that are under per se almost illegality. And I think that's not what the US policymakers would want, and that's definitely not what the US courts will accept to have. I think that is because they will go against so many principles. Just very quickly, US antitrust laws, at the end of the day, is a kind of codification of the common law, right? It came out of the common law, and at some point, the common law and the rule of reason are so essential to the enforcement of US antitrust laws. So I'm very skeptical about the fact that US judges will approve these kind of presumptions, quick looked, or lowering the evidentiary standards that the Europeans have had for many years, if not decades. Now we're talking about shifting the burden of proof. Like, just to take one example, shifting the burden of proof just means that you're guilty unless proven innocent, right? So that will mean that many companies have to demonstrate that they have done nothing wrong unless, and that is much harder, and that will of course ease the work of antitrust enforcers, but it doesn't mean that we will promote competition, or it doesn't mean that we will promote innovation just to ease the work of antitrust officials if there are too many false positives at the end of the day. And this is exactly the time of US antitrust history, namely the 60s, we departed from, and I think we should refrain from going back to. And that is exactly the time when what the neo-Brandeisians have as a point of reference, and they claim to go back to.
Okay, and Kathy, you'd like to address also, and maybe kind of what we're talking about why the European model would hurt the US, but what have the Europeans lost by not being moving more in the direction of the American model, and why do we want to keep that American model in place?
Well, the original thought that was coming to my head is the antitrust pendulum in the United States may not be an effective one. It seems to swing between doing probably a lot less than we should on the enforcement front to all of a sudden wanting to just go crazy on the enforcement front. And it's sort of missing a reasonable middle. I think to some degree, we've not been minding the store. We've let certain mergers happen that probably were not good ideas, not good for the public, not good for the market, not good for competition, whether in motive because they were going to obliterate a competitor, or something else where maybe we should have asked more questions. I don't like that we now are missing a mobile telco company because somebody wanted to merge and we're like, okay, fine. So But that definitely, you obliterated a competitor, and now the market is suffering from that. And maybe that was not the correct enforcement decision. And there's been a lot of mergers that have happened that have not necessarily gotten perhaps adequate scrutiny. Even if you want to argue about, well, some might be tricky, but you should have let them go. I think you can also make a compelling argument that we kind of missed the boat on a few of them, and that's a problem. New tech is also very challenging, though, because then we also did things where we had AT&T be Ma Bell for generations, decades and decades, and squeezing out competition, and it ended up being really revolutionary when we opened that up. The problem with new tech is it's hard to do right, because you don't know at what point the original idea has reached escape velocity and at what point you've accidentally smothered it in the cradle. It's tricky, and these things are scary. And I think the point that would be good to stick to is that you need to be principled. You can't have this wishy-washy, know it when we see it. You need to kind of follow with what is the thing we're trying to keep our eye on the ball on? Can you articulate it? Can you talk about, we want more competitors, we want pricing competition, we want more innovation? And then it may be an overlapping set of decisions, but something that guides it, as opposed to, we're mad, we're upset, this got too big, or other interests that allow us to sort of sit on our hands and not do things when mergers are happening because somebody's gonna get a financial upside to it, and fine, let's let them. Then you ask the question of, what has Europe missed? I think the European question is a little bit more complicated than just competition law, because underpinning all of this, including in the United States, is also corporate law and how we structure our companies and what rules guide how companies operate and make decisions and need to be transparent to investors and need to return money to investors, and things like that. And that is also very different in Europe than it is here. The two things end up speaking to each other, but like I suggested in my last utterance, that we should be looking at other areas of law that end up speaking to antitrust, like giving monopolies via intellectual property rights. I think we also have to ask some questions about corporate law and how we structure us. And I think when we look at Europe, even though we might be tempted to criticize a lot of the anti-competition things that we look at Europe and say, Europe, how can you be happy with this and the decisions that you've made? Some of them are anti-competition law driven decisions, but some of them are corporate law decisions, and some other things like they don't have the robust intermediary liability protections and various other things that exist in the United States. So I don't think we can necessarily say, look, Europe, if you're suffering where it's American competitors you're unhappy with because you don't have enough of your own, the reason they don't have enough of their own is a little bit more complex than just saying they got antitrust law wrong.
Okay, and an audience Q&A, I think we have, what are the effects on innovation, I guess maybe to Chris, from aggressive antitrust enforcement from the Federal Trade Commission's Chair Khan's procedural changes and lack of transparency, to the congressional Democrats, actually with a little Republican support, recently unveiling a package of antitrust reform bills, proposals that ignore the consumer welfare standard and really take this European approach. What will be the effects on innovation?
Sure. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the United States has the most innovative tech companies in the world, not by accident. Like Kathy was saying, there are a lot of different factors that go into it, including, rule of law, respect for private property, independent courts. All of that goes into, whether a country has an economy that is going to grow or, recede. And I think one of the things that is really interesting about the United States is that at this exact moment in time, Congress is debating whether it should spend over $100 billion in research and development. I think a lot of elected officials are starting to notice that American companies are no longer the only ones on the international world stage. You have a lot of tech companies from China, India, and of course, there's a few in the EU like Spotify, but not many. And these, competitors are getting a ton of support from their home countries. I mean, I think the EU does use its antitrust laws to give their domestic companies a leg up over American competitors. But what is interesting is that Congress wants to spend all of this money in research and development, and at the same time, it wants to take down the companies that spend the most money on research and development and that develop some of the best
partners. Yeah.
Right. And so it's kind of like, the left hand isn't talking to the right hand, because like at the end of the day, if you want to project American strength on the world stage, if you want America to lead the way with innovation, and if you want companies to invest in research and development, then you give them the leeway to do just that. You don't hobble them because they have, they're spending too much money, or they make too much money, or they have too many consumers. I mean, that is very odd to care more about that than what they're actually doing with their money. And if you look at like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, they are spending billions of dollars every single year on trying to develop new products. I mean, Amazon's Alexa, it was an idea that Jeff Bezos got from Steve Jobs. And then Amazon spent billions of dollars over several years perfecting that technology. And now, we have Apple's personal assistant Siri, we have Amazon's Alexa, we have Google Home. So, there is not just robust competition in the marketplace, but more importantly, it's robust competition with products that were unimaginable just 10 years ago. And I think that that is key to understanding the United States and the way that we have traditionally viewed antitrust, which is we don't like when companies act in ways that hurt consumers, but we are willing to give them some leeway to experiment with new business models. You think about the entire digital ecosystem, that is completely new, right? I mean, everything, this idea that you can have Facebook and Google search for free, that there's no monthly subscription fee, that's pretty revolutionary in the business world. But all of those developments came because these companies had the flexibility and the freedom to experiment and to perfect these new business models. And I think one of the things that is so scary about the European approach is that the moment you do something new, you get regulators looking at you very skeptically. And, you look, Kathy mentioned, right, you get a target on your back the moment you come up with a new idea. Why? Because it's disruption. And I think that's really the big difference between the United States and other countries. We don't always like disruption, but we put a very high premium on this idea that tomorrow is going to be a better day, that there's always a better way to do things. And so we accept disruption. Look at Sears, right? It was considered the monopoly in retail, and Sears created the Discover credit card. It also at one point owned Prodigy. And it had its own in-house brands like Kenmore and Craftsman. Sears is bankrupt. It doesn't even exist, right? So when Sears first went onto the scene, everybody was like, oh, wow, look at this like mail order catalog. What a cool thing. But of course, small businesses were like, wait, we don't like this. No. Don't compete with us through the mail. And in Europe, I think that, perhaps the antitrust enforcers would have prevented Sears from sending out their catalog in the mail, saying, this is not fair. You have to have a physical store. How dare you make it convenient for consumers to order? And in the US, we allowed Sears to do all that. And of course, 100 years later, Sears is now gone and it's been replaced by new companies. And so I think that, when we talk about innovation, it's not just, research and development, but it's also a certain level of comfort with disruption and allowing the market to change. And I think all too often in Europe, there is a preference for the status quo. There is a preference for keeping things the same. And while consistency certainly has its benefits, again, look at the United States and all the cool stuff that our tech companies are responsible for producing compared to the rest of the world.
But briefly, we have a question because we're going to have to close up here at 12:55 with our final questions. But Aurelian, I did want to add a question to you about, is there any component, from the audience here, is there any component of EU antitrust law that we should adopt domestically? And are the European and US approaches currently able to harmonize and how might that, is there anything in that area?
All right. So before answering that question, I think I'll just follow up on what Chris has said, because it's very important and it was very stressful on what we're discussing here. I think it is key that the EU competition rule and also the EU competition mentality is dominated by what I describe as a precautionary principle. This is what Chris has said as a status quo, like the presumption against disruptions, because at some point disruptions harms rivals and the status quo is preferred. And I think there's a strong stance on the precautionary principle. And that is exactly what we see with the new Digital Market Act that will regulate EU antitrust for digital competition, with ex-ante rules, like you regulate even before harms take place. And the US antitrust bills, very surprisingly, almost transplant the EU Digital Market Act with this precautionary approach of ex-ante rules. So what we're talking is not theoretical, it's very practical. And the mentality of the precautionary approach, which I think runs against innovation and disruptions, is subreptiously entering into the US through the bills or through the FTC. And on the process of disruptions, I think this is precisely what Joseph Schumpeter has described as the process of creative destruction, where you need to destroy things for the innovative ways to emerge. And this is the skepticism that the Europeans may have that the Americans don't have. And I think it's very important to preserve that and for the Americans to be attached and be very committed to this process of creative destructions. And otherwise, then just to come back to your question, Barbara, on what's the effect of antitrust in innovation, then at the end of the day, there will be more innovation deterrence and there will be less innovative firms, right? In the long run, I'm not saying in the next few weeks or in the next few months, but in the long run, the mentality will stifle innovation. So what should we take from EU competition rules? I'm very skeptical, because I was very pro the kind of Americanization of EU competition rules over the last decades. I mean, that's what we've seen for the last decades, how the consumer welfare standards entered into Europe in the late 90s, in the early 2000s. So we've seen that process, and it was appraised by people from politicians in Europe on the left, politicians in Europe on the right. So it was praised very consensually. And so I'm very skeptical about this shift, not only that the European is becoming more and more aggressive with cases that are almost very weakly designed. I mean, I'm talking about the Google cases that are now in the court, and I'm very skeptical about the outcome. We see a number of state aid cases by the European Commission completely lost, scrambled by the European Court of Justice. So these are weak cases that are brought forward in the name of EU aggressive enforcement. And I'm very skeptical that these weak cases are precisely the source of inspiration for American policymakers. And so I think that we need more coordination in order to make sure that the consumer welfare standards, that the innovation incentives are better aligned between the two regimes, but it doesn't mean to transplant the precautionary antitrust that Europe is increasingly embarking on to the US. So I think we need more coordination, but for middle, perhaps as Cathy said, as a middle road, as something more economically grounded, objectively discussed, and not discretionary rules or arbitrary discussions that are precisely harming firms, not only because of the cost, but because of the legal uncertainty, the legal unpredictability that all these rules create for innovative firms.
Yes, and it would, of course, lead to more politicization of antitrust instead of having that more neutral standard. So, we've got to close up here. It's been great to have, these international experts here with such a wide diversity of experience. And so I'd like to ask each of you maybe about a minute. I guess we maybe have about a minute and a half for each of you to sort of, summarize and, kind of answering that, our beginning question is, could adopting European antitrust spell disaster for American innovation? How you might summarize and make some of the key points that you'd like to leave with our audience today.
I'll go first. I feel some, I don't know if it's sympathy or empathy with the European perspective. They live in a modern world where a lot of their lives end up interacting with companies that are American, and they don't feel very good about that. And I can have some sympathy for that reaction. I've spoken to some people over there who've used the word colonized. They feel colonized by American companies. And boy, that's quite an emotion to have these discussions around, because that's, so evocative. So I think some of the reaction is, on one hand, unfortunate and counterproductive, because there is a reason that these companies are American and not European. And it would be much more helpful for everybody if we could understand what it would take to actually launch more European competitors, because here in America, we would benefit from having more competitors, including European ones. So we'd all be better off if we could sort of get the innovative economy in Europe to function a little bit better. But you can sort of see how the regulatory reaction is something that essentially is protectionist, that they want to get rid of the American competitors in theory to create space for the domestic ones. I don't think that will work, but I can understand that reflex. The problem is in America, we have a similar emotional reaction to these companies, although it's, they're domestic, but we don't seem to have a great sense of patriotism around them, but we don't like them equally. And so we want to blow them up, but that isn't even protectionist. That starts to be irrational. So that's definitely not something we should take, that emotion that is driving European policy and surf on that emotion and have it inform American policy, because even more conspicuously, it's not actually in our interest, and it's counterproductive for anything valuable people would actually like and need antitrust in a pure doctrinal form to be able to deliver to us.
So first, I just find it hilarious that the Europeans feel colonized. I mean, a little ironic there. But also, I would say to the Europeans that if they want to have their own companies that can rival American tech companies, then they should change their laws to promote innovation and competition, and not, leave businesses guessing whether or not they do something is going to be, a legal liability. And I think it's really important that the law be clear about what's allowed and what's not. Because when the law is clear, then you incentivize, private businesses to order their affairs accordingly. They can make investments, they can, plan all their expenditures and so forth, which is important. But to the question at hand, I think it would be a disaster for American innovation, American consumers, and American leadership on the world stage to adopt the European approach. Every law is, everything in life is about trade-offs, and every law is about trade-offs. And I think, the Europeans have made the decision that they are willing to trade off innovation and, having large popular companies in return for having control over their economy and having a sense that they can kind of dictate where things are going to go. In the US, we made the opposite trade-off. We are willing to give our companies more freedom because we want them to surprise us. We want them to come up with things that were unimaginable, a year prior. In America, we prefer the new and better to the old and stale. And I think that that is a trade-off that we made very wisely. And I think it is one that we should continue, especially if, we no longer live in a world where we can close ourselves off and say to the rest of the world, nope, we're not going to compete against you. No, we have to compete on the world stage. And at the end of the day, if you look at how life is becoming ever more digitized, I would prefer that America have a leading role in making sure that the next century is going to be on our terms. And I think, having our companies be the ones to do that it's in our best interest. And therefore we should not, arbitrarily change our laws to make it easier to punish companies we don't like, because that short-term trade-off is going to do a lot of long-term harm. And I just don't think it's worth it at all.
Yeah, just to answer the question whether or not it would be a disaster, I mean, my answer would be yes and no. Pessimistically, yes, I think it would harm innovation because there will be less cheaper price, less disruptive behaviors and conduct. And why do I say no? Just to be more optimistic, perhaps, because I believe that the entrepreneurial spirit in America is so strong that antitrust laws, we don't have to overestimate antitrust laws as well, right? Antitrust laws is one of those laws amongst many laws in the US. So we don't have to overestimate antitrust laws. So even if antitrust enforcers want to stifle or may stifle innovation by transplanting a European model to America, I think the entrepreneurial spirit in the Silicon Valley or in other tech hubs in the US is so strong that there's no antitrust officials that will disrupt and kill this spirit. Just look at Microsoft. It was almost killed, dead 20 years ago. Microsoft is still here. There's this resilience that is, I think it's great, and we need to preserve that. And why no? Because precisely, I think the courts will be the guardrails, in a sense that the common law traditions of the US antitrust laws and the rule of reason, the requirements for strong evidentiary standards, such as the demonstration of the harm, will be these kind of requirements that the courts will not renege on. And the court will, I think, mitigates the policymakers' potential harm on innovation in terms of transplanting the European competition system to the US. So I think it's great that the US antitrust law system relies on law enforcement, on court system, because they may be the one that will protect, at the end of the day, the consumer welfare standards, even if these standards may be stifled or at least deranged by some bills or laws.
Well, that is a great note to end on, to celebrate American entrepreneurs and innovation. And you're right, they usually do rise above whatever complications might be put in their way. So that's a good thing for us to end on. And thank you all for joining us today. Thanks for the audience for joining us on this important and very current topic. We appreciate having you here with us today. And we really, this is an engaged group, and we really appreciate the opportunity for this discussion today. So thank you from NetChoice and to all the panelists. And I believe this panel will also be available online at netchoice.org and also on probably the Twitter feed and any other social media platforms that you might frequent.